people, but probably by now only has 300 or 400. But so, I mean, just not only does it wipe out half of the men, but it takes out almost all the leadership as well. So the Confederates straggle back to where they started. Lee goes up to Pickett and he says, rally your division for a possible counterattack. And Pickett just says to General Lee, he says, General Lee, I have no division. Famous line, very, very sad. And Pickett never forgave Lee. Later on, he was writing, and he said, in his writings, he said, that man destroyed my division. And Lee realizes it's been a complete disaster. It's Fredericksburg in reverse. Just a suicidal assault on a fortified position. And Lee says to the men, this is all my fault. It's all my fault. And the men are going, no, no, no. Of course, Robert E. Lee doesn't make mistakes, right? But in this case, I think he did. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And something else I saw with Pickett is that at some point, Lee and Longstreet are trying to console him. And Lee, imagining all the heroics and the chivalry of the Civil War, he tells him that their gallantry had earned them a place in history. Well, that's not a pick-me-up for Pickett. And then he says in response, all the glory in the world could never atone for the widows and orphans this day. And yeah, like you said, he blames Lee for the rest of his life for the massacre. We should point out that this Pickett's charge is infamous for the reasons you just described here. And from my education, especially my high school education, I remember very little of the Civil War, but I think for a lot of history teachers who don't know much about the Civil War, they'll glom onto this fact to say, oh, look at these people. They were idiots. They were storming on an open field just to be picked off by someone with a rifle that could be accurate up to a few hundred yards. But as you and I have talked about many times in this series, on the very top of the episode, that, as you said, the technology to kill had advanced, but the technology to heal had not. Sometimes there were simply fortified positions that you could not advance in your strategy unless you took those positions. Sometimes there was no better option to do that because you didn't have any better technology to resist the rifles. And it's not as if the Union didn't do the same thing. If you go back in the archives a little bit, for History Unplugged, you can find an interview where I talked to the director of the Manassas National Park. And the Battle of Second Manassas, there's a reverse situation of the Union where they're storming an open field like this, and then they have to withdraw to disastrous effect like Pickett's charge. And the guest on the episode said that there were Confederate soldiers who were firing on these Union troops, and they themselves were also at Gettysburg, and they commented that this is as bad or maybe even worse than Gettysburg. And with the director that I talked to, they were actually doing an excavation of a surgeon's pit where they found 2 intact skeletons of Union soldiers, and they could determine through forensic evidence that one had been shot in the buttocks as he was probably fleeing, and for hundreds of yards they had to run. So this was done on both sides. But just one other thing I want to mention with this, as you were saying, James, that Lee told the troops, this is all my fault, and many of them must have been dumbfounded because some of them commented that up till then they had, like much of the Confederate Army, they had almost blind faith in Lee. They thought that everything would come out all right, even if they couldn't understand the orders that were being given, even if it didn't seem to make sense from their perspective. Many could assume that, well, there's a grand strategy here that I can't see the forest for the trees because General Lee had planned it. So, but there's one historian, Bevan Alexander, who criticized his order and said, when his direct efforts to knock aside the Union forces failed, Lee compounded his error by destroying the last offensive power of the Army of Northern Virginia and Pickett's charge across nearly a mile of open, bullet and shell torn ground. So he thinks that the frontal assault was doomed before it started.
Yeah, let me follow up on that. In defense of Lee, he came so close on day 2, and he really felt if we just hit him one more time, one more punch, they'll fall over. He felt like they were just ready to collapse. They'd done so much damage to the Union line, and they'd almost broken through. One more knockout punch will do it. And he had fresh troops, so it wasn't completely insane, although he should have known better because he knew what happened at Fredericksburg. And we've seen this, and it's going to continue to happen where even though these generals know that attacking a fortified position across an open field in a regular frontal assault is totally insane. They do it anyway. I mean, Grant's going to do it, believe it or not, later on.
What else are you going to do?
Yeah, sometimes it just seems like there's no alternative. Right. Sherman's going to do it. So we're going to see everybody tries it at least once or twice. Maybe they think, well, these other guys can't do it, but these guys, I can, and my men can. So we're going to see that the frontal assault is not about to go away anytime soon, despite this.
So to give the listeners another shot, because you've given them a lot with mentioning movies, James, classic Napoleonic tactics that were effective in the early 1800s when you have muskets, but with rifled bullets, not so good. So Napoleonic tactics, another reason why they don't belong in the 1860s, or they need to be updated.
Yeah, okay. Remember, listeners, remember the rule. Whenever Scott mentions Napoleon or tactics, you take a shot of your favorite beverage, and whenever I mention a movie, boy, they're gonna, depending on what you're drinking, you may be kind of about to fall out of the chair by now. But
make it whiskey or apple brandy, or is that what was the apple drink they had back then?
Hard cider.
Hard cider, yeah.
William Henry Harrison's favorite drink.
Yeah, get your hard cider or your whiskey.
But not if you're driving, folks, please.
All right, well, let's just take a look at the outcome. I mean, we always tally the results at the end of these major battles, and it doesn't get much more major than Gettysburg. So
it does not get much more major. That is a good point. This is the granddaddy of them all. The Confederates suffer 28,000 casualties. That is 1/3 of their army. So think about that. For every 3 guys that crossed the Potomac and marched into Pennsylvania, 1 is gone. 17 of 52 Confederate generals were casualties. I talked earlier about the generals that were killed just in Pickett's charge, while others were killed in other parts of the battle. The Union lost about 23,000 men. So the total number of casualties is 51,000. That's killed, wounded, missing. Yeah, 51,000. That is huge, and that makes Gettysburg the bloodiest battle of the Civil War in terms of total casualties. Now, I want to say real quick that a couple of our listeners may be thinking, now that's 3 different battles you've said are the bloodiest. So which one is true? So Gettysburg gets the prize for the most total killed. And it's over 3 days. So that's not too surprising. Antietam was the single bloodiest day. It's the battle. Antietam had more people killed in 1 day than any other of the battles of the Civil War. And then we talked about a battle in Tennessee called Murfreesboro or Stones River. That one had the highest percentage of casualties. So I don't want to have our people be confused. But this one takes the prize in the total body count. Many regiments were almost destroyed. One Tennessee regiment started with 960 men when Gettysburg, that's at the beginning of the war. When the Battle of Gettysburg began, they had only 365 left. By the end of the first day, there were only 60. By the end of the battle, there were only 3. Ooh. 3 men. That's not much of a regiment. Lee realizes now he really does have to retreat. He can't stay any longer, so he retreats back to Virginia on July 4th. And, of course, this has a lot of symbolic significance.
Same day as Manassas, or not Manassas, Vicksburg.
Vicksburg, yeah, and it's Independence Day. It's a northern holiday, and so a lot of people have a tendency to think maybe God is shining on us. Lee has to retreat. Not only does he retreat, but he retreats on July 4th. And as you mentioned, they get the news of Vicksburg. And so it is a great day for the Union. Meade wanted to pursue Lee's army. He really wanted to. But doing so was nearly impossible. The Confederate position would have been too strong. And we've talked about this many times, how an army is usually just as exhausted from winning as they are from losing. So Meade isn't able to do a whole lot. Lincoln doesn't really understand this. I mean, this battle is definitely a Union victory, no question about it. The Union inflicted more casualties, and they held the ground by the end of the battle. But many in the North felt it should have been a much bigger victory. Lincoln was disappointed that Meade did not do more to destroy Lee's army. And the Confederacy, believe it or not, does not see it as a major disaster. It had no negative effect on Lee's reputation, at least not at the time. Although Longstreet much later wrote that Gettysburg was ground of no value. That day was the saddest day of my life.
You're right. And I think, like you said earlier, it's easy to beat up on Lee after Gettysburg, but there were points where he was close, and in his mind, he might be thinking, well, I didn't win, but I should have won. Tactics that did work in the past and strategic moves. And one example, I thought this was an interesting conversation he had after the battle ended. It was either the night of the 4th or the next day. So at night, he's riding alone among his troops, and he meets a brigadier general, John Imboden. I don't know. You probably know how better to pronounce that. I'm not
No,
sure.
I don't actually.
Okay, so he meets a brigadier general of a Imboden, one of those, who says, "General, this has been a hard day for you." And he responds, "Yes, it has been a sad, sad day to us." And he praises Pickett's men, but then he says, "If they had been supported as they were to have been, but for some reason not fully explained to me were not, we would have held the position and the day would have been ours. Too bad." So General Alexander, he found the statement kind of strange because Lee was the commanding general and he had seen the entire preparation and execution. But maybe in Lee's mind, he wanted to give his officers leeway, and certain actions which had been faithfully executed in the past weren't now. So it didn't even seem to be clear in his mind why it lost. And maybe we can give some room for the gray areas in this too. But so is Gettysburg the turning point of the war, as so many people say it is? What do you think?
That's a good question. I was always taught in school, oh, this is the turning point of the war. Now, most scholars today will say, no, it was not. Almost nothing changed. I mean, yes, the Confederates had to retreat. It did stop Confederate momentum. So it's not like it's insignificant. It's a very significant battle. But turning point of the war is probably a little bit too much. This is the last time Lee would invade the North, and it probably made European intervention impossible. But of course, they didn't know this at the time. They didn't know Lee's never going to invade the North again. This is the high water mark of the Confederacy, as some people say it. I don't subscribe to a single turning point of the Civil War. I believe that there were several key points, several turning points, if you will, and a lot of them are the battles we're mentioning in these podcasts. But no, we're going to see that the war is going to go on for almost 2 more years. And the Confederates are going to continue to fight on, and they're going to fight hard, and they're going to fight well. Robert E. Lee is going to continue to lead the Army quite well. The Union is going to continue to struggle. Sorry to give away the spoiler there, everybody, but the war does not end after Gettysburg, not even close, not by any means. So no, not the turning point, just one of many, many key actions that did influence the war quite significantly.
Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors.
And this is getting a little bit into historiography, or how history is made. These ideas that it's a turning point, that's a effective hook, a fact that you would remember for a high school exam. And maybe there's a history professor who's writing one of these textbooks for high schoolers. Which, by the way, man, I wish I could have gotten into one of those gigs, because that is how you make some cash as a history professor.
Yeah.
And there are few ways to do so. The best, of course, is to write a book and then force all of your university students to buy it, so you have endless royalties and commission coming in. But I digress. What I was going to say is that you give these simple narratives or simple facts, but usually you can find some sort of quote to glom onto that supports your thesis, and it makes it seem very clear-cut. And I just want to show you a quote that I think is popular for people who want to create this clean narrative of Gettysburg as a turning point. And if all you had was the statement that Gettysburg is a turning point in this quote, you would think it being as simple as that. So the Confederate Chief of Ordnance, Josiah Gorgas, on July 28th, this is after Gettysburg, this is after Vicksburg, and he's bemoaning the change in rebel fortunes. It seems like everything was the wind was at their back, and now they're issued these major defeats. So what he says, after Lee failed at Gettysburg and he recrossed Potomac and he resumed the position of 2 months ago, covering Richmond, alas, he has lost 15,000 men and 25,000 stands of arms. Vicksburg and Port Hudson capitulated, surrendering 35,000 men and 45,000 arms. It seems incredible that human power could effect such a change in so brief a space. Yesterday we rode on the pinnacle of success. Today, absolute ruin seems to be our portion. The Confederacy totters to its destruction. But it